Hello, everyone. Welcome to Automation Hour. This is our 92nd episode. So if you're joining us for the first time, all lines will be muted. Please post any questions that you have to our Trailblazer community, Salesforce Automation Hour. And sometime after the session, we will post the link to the recording as well as the deck out on our Trailblazer community, Salesforce Automation Hour, on our website, automationhour.com, and you'll see me tweet about it as well. All right, so we are fully booked out for the rest of 2020. So if you haven't registered for our sessions, I recommend that you do. Even if you can't attend live, you'll get notification that the recording has been posted. So we have some returning presenters. Parker's going to come back and present twice to us. And then we have MVPs. As well as our own co-host, Rakesh, who will be presenting on October 23rd. So I'm going to highlight that session. So definitely register for that. And we can't bring this free webinar series to you without our sponsor, Concrete.io. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And here are your co-hosts. I'm here with David and Rakesh. And I'm excited to have Dominic Ionadi back on Automation Hour with us to present. So with that, I am going to hand over to Dom. You should have control.
Okay, one sec. All right, you guys seeing the deck? Perfect. Well, thanks so much, Jen, for the intro and for having me back. I did present last year, and really, really excited to be back on Automation Hour. As mentioned, Dominic Ionadi, just call me Dom. I'm the Vice President of Financial Services at Brightmark Inc. Brightmark is a Salesforce and Pardot consulting company based just north of Toronto. And I joined them last October. Prior to that, I've spent most of my entire career in financial services. And, about 6 years ago, classic accidental admin story. I was joining a company called Burgundy Asset Management, and they were implementing Salesforce at the time. And I joined a week before they went into production. It sort of basically became my job. So I think it's a kind of like a lot of us, typical accidental admin sort of story. I used to say that I was self-taught admin, but I think really community taught is much more appropriate, because as I learned sort of early on in my career, there's so much power and so much great information out there out in the community with Salesforce, and a lot of talented people willing to share that information. And I definitely learned a lot from it. And I've actually started to go down that certification path. Finally, I figured, if we're consulting, should probably be certified. So I've knocked off a couple, and got a couple more coming up this year. So also like to call myself a self-proclaimed Automation Hour super fan. So a big fan of this group, and the presenters that come on are really outstanding, and just so many tips and things that I've learned on this particular group. So very appreciative of that. I do enjoy presenting and talking about Salesforce. I've presented at a number of different events, community events, local community user groups, a couple world tours. Remember when we used to have in-person world tours? Those were fun. And again, as was able to be on Automation Hour last year and fulfill my my lifelong dream. So definitely reach out, connect with me on LinkedIn. If you like what you hear today, I'm always looking to widen the network and talk to people about Salesforce. Share best practices, learn from others. And if you don't like what you hear and you want to argue about it, that's even better, because that's how we learn here. So away from the office, outside of Salesforce, I am a married father of 3. I am a huge football fan, big fan of the Green Bay Packers. And I also run a youth flag football organization in my hometown of Whitby. So there's a picture of just a bunch of us there on the left-hand side. So definitely enjoy doing that. And again, no season this year, unfortunately, due to COVID, but we will definitely be back next year. And of course, on the right-hand side, my pride and joy Lambo, who's my golden retriever. And I think it's pretty typical, right? If you're on a Salesforce presentation, you got to have a picture of your cat or dog. So definitely want to make sure that he was included in that. So our agenda for today, obviously we're just doing the intro now, is really just to share sort of best practices, tips, things that I've learned, from others along the way, in order to, set yourself up for success when it comes to actually designing and building out these great automations that we see, like the ones we see on Automation Hour, right? So I'm going to talk about a few different things, and those are just the basic sections there. Don't worry, I know the headings look kind of heavy for a Friday afternoon in early summer, but we'll try and keep it light and keep it conversational as much as we can in this sort of a venue. So if you've got questions, please post them, and I'll try and pause maybe after each section and take some questions. But if not, we definitely will have some time at the end. And as I mentioned earlier, happy to keep the conversation going after the fact, either in the Trailblazer community or just offline. So looking forward to today's presentation, and I hope you're able to glean at least one or two kind of good things out of it. So the first thing that I am going to talk about is what I call having a philosophy. So again, I'm not a philosophy major, but I do believe that when it comes to automation in Salesforce, it's important to have a philosophy. And if you don't want to have a philosophy, I mean, I think that's cool too. You don't have to have a philosophy. You can have a set of guiding principles or a framework or a code or a manifesto, but ultimately, you just want to have something, some basic belief system that's going to help guide your thinking as you approach, different problems and how you want to solve them. It really just sort of becomes your way of doing things. And when you think about, kind of the philosophy, it's really just about your approach. So again, not to get too deep here, you don't have to live on top of a mountain for 6 months to come up with, your personal philosophy on automation. You can borrow one. It doesn't have to be original. I think, I don't know if this is a scientific fact, but I think that there's like really only 27 great ideas out there about Salesforce. They've probably all been published. So it's really about kind of harnessing, what's out there and making it your own, and then just applying it, really, right? So we want to, you feel free to borrow anything that's out there. Just, make sure that you have something and it's really, meeting your needs. I'm also not a computer scientist. Sorry for the slide trick there. I don't really have a computer science or, an IT sort of background in terms of education, but there's a lot of interesting work out there in terms of, software and programming philosophies, and really aspects of these that, I think really apply well to Salesforce and to Salesforce automation. So, one of the popular ones that you see out there is more of a principle, I guess, is dry or don't repeat yourself, or, you see things written about minimalism or, having a single source of truth, kind of all these sorts of things are, are along the same theme, which is really, we want to be avoiding duplication, right? We want to design and we want to build things in a modular fashion, sort of reusable components, so that, we're not constantly, going back and repeating ourselves in terms of, how we craft our solutions. We want to reuse logic instead of rebuilding it. Not only does it, reduce clutter and keep things clean and simple, there are practical approaches to this. So you don't want to build out a set of logic in one process for evaluating account records, let's say, as an example, only to have similar logic or similar processes running somewhere else. Not only is the, not an elegant or an efficient way of configuring this, it's not technically sound either. And there's a reason why, people that are smarter than me and, now Salesforce is starting to warn you about this as well, about not having, or rather, suggesting to have one process builder or one automation per object. I did learn that originally right here on Automation Hour, but you want to capture everything. You want to capture all that logic and branching so that you're not having Salesforce go back and processing the same record, let's say, multiple times, because you've decided to build 3 separate process builders in a flow on the account object. Another practical application of this philosophy is when it comes to troubleshooting, and nobody builds it right the first time, I don't think. So when you're trying to figure out, what's wrong with your process or with your flow or your automation in general, you it's a lot easier when you have one place to look as opposed to, oh, it might have been, this process that I built over here, or it might have been this flow I designed 2 years ago, or, this set of workflow rules that I have firing somewhere else. So from a troubleshooting perspective, again, another good practical application of this approach is it facilitates your troubleshooting, makes things a lot easier. And of course, controlling the order of execution, can be done a lot better when you've got a single automation per object, or even better when you're using a single tool, right? So again, if you've got multiple things that are doing something kind of similar, you can't really control when things are firing, and it can just wind up in a bit of a mess. Combining your actions and your updates, again, I'll talk a little bit about limits later, but again, just making things more efficient from a process design perspective, and then ultimately how we're going to execute it. We don't want Salesforce going back and updating the same record multiple times, because we're going to be tripping over ourselves and, again, running into limits and potentially, damaging what we've set out to do. There's actually, Rakesh had a really good blog post about this. I think it was about a year and a half ago, that actually came across recently, ironically enough. So definitely check that out. But there's lots of, solid material and sort of thinking out there on this particular concept. And of course, when it comes to, not repeating yourself and building reusable components, we've got the tools at our disposal. So flow, we can have subflows. Process builder can call other processes. We can call flows. So, again, thinking through that big picture and making sure that we're piecing, all the different components together in an intelligent fashion is really gonna help you. And then lastly, using the right tool for the job. And again, lots of good sort of content in Salesforce and various blog posts and different things about how to choose the right tool. But it's not all about picking just, let's say, the right declarative tool. You want to think big pictures. Also, when do we need to code, for example, or when should we be thinking about that kind of stuff? And that comes up a lot, obviously, sort of clicks versus code. And as someone with more of an admin background in terms of Salesforce skill set, I generally subscribe to using clicks over code, and I do believe that that is always where you want to start, and that really should be your intention. But I do also think that it could be short-sighted and a little bit unwise to be absolute or too rigid in this thinking. So there's a camp of people that will say, well, no, like we're never going to customize because we want to use Salesforce as it was meant to be used. But you have to really sort of think things through, and I think the preference should be definitely, and it is my preference, no code or low code tools, but you do have to evaluate on a case-by-case basis depending on what your needs are and what the objectives are of the particular project. So when people ask me, when do you go to Apex versus Flow, for example, or Process Builder, and I usually tell them jokingly that if I can't get the thing working after 12 attempts, then it's time to it's time to code. But in all seriousness, again, look at the problem and start asking the questions and ask yourself, are there really complex processing rules, for example, that can't easily be accommodated using one of the declarative tools? Are we going to run into limits? Are there performance considerations that could potentially trip us up if we decide to go down one path or the other, using a declarative tool versus using code? But another key consideration is really the skill set. So me personally, I'm not going to go in and write Apex, but I rely on other people and sort of work in a team team setting to get that accomplished. So you would need to sort of take a look at what the skill set is in your own organization. So do you have devs on your team, or do you have a partner that you can lean on in this particular case? So you need to think through all of those things, again, not only from a technical perspective, but from a people perspective as well. And you want to think about these things in advance so that we don't end up going down a path where you may end up with a subpar solution, or worse, end up in a situation where you've got to do a bunch of rework. So our next section is, again, maybe a little bit too heavy in terms of a title, but really it's titled Applying Critical Thinking. And even when the CEO says that we need to do something. Now, years ago, I was part of a strategic planning exercise, and the facilitator talked about how it's always dangerous. It's always a dangerous initiative if it starts with someone high up in the organization saying, we need, X, or we need fill in the blank. This doesn't mean that it's a bad idea necessarily, but we do want to be thinking critically and really always doing a proper analysis whenever we get engaged on a particular initiative or on a particular project. Don't get caught up in what people are asking for. I think this does tend to happen. We want to get on with things. We want to get moving, and it's all about speed and turning things around. And it's fun. We want to get in there and we want to start building. But oftentimes we can get sidetracked or too focused on what people are asking for, as opposed to actually conducting a proper analysis and making sure that we've got well-defined requirements or user stories going into a process. So we want to think through the process, and we want to be absolutely crystal clear on what the goal and what the success criteria are. And sometimes I advise people take the perspective as if there was no system. When you're automating and you're building on Salesforce, it's almost too easy to get in and get started. And because there's so much information out there, sometimes people have just a little bit of information or a little bit of knowledge about a particular area, and they want to, sort of automatically go down that path or sort of direct you into that. And you really, I think sometimes say, take the perspective as if there was no system at all. So if you're really kind of breaking down the process step by step, how would it work as if there were no system involved? So you can really get at what that business process is, and then actually go ahead and implement it properly. Also want to think big picture. Again, not just being too quick to respond to a specific request or being too tactical, but thinking back to the big picture that we spoke about earlier, making sure that we don't end up with duplication or conflict because we already had something that was available, potentially just needed to be tweaked versus completely rebuilt. Another area of analysis that I think tends to get overlooked is really on the people side. So we're really good generally at analyzing and talking about functional requirements. Hey, what are we trying to accomplish? What does the system need to do? But we don't always do a good job about thinking about the stakeholders and really conducting that stakeholder analysis. And stakeholders, that runs both internal stakeholders, so your users, employees, people sort of going to be interacting with the system, and then of course your external stakeholders, which are your customers. Understand who has influence and really think about these things going in, because they will drive further questions, right? Again, the CEO stands up and says, we need this. Everyone starts rushing to build because, they sort of just take that at face value, but we may not be thinking about the entire process from different perspectives and how, maybe there are downstream impacts on other systems, other automations that you built, let alone, again, user impacts and, impacts to business processes and things like that. So you don't want to be caught in a situation where you're only looking at the problem from a single perspective. And, you really want to make sure that you're conducting that proper analysis from both a, process and technology perspective, making sure we've got the right tool, making sure that we understand the process, but also, on the people side of things as well. We also want to understand and, really remember as we go through the project, the why. And again, if we're doing our proper analysis, we want to make sure that we're always able to understand that question, that it's top of mind as to why we're actually doing something. It's probably the most important thing to know and to really understand when it comes to any particular project or use case, particularly as things go on. Project drags on and you sort of get bogged down into, building out different deliverables or designing different processes, and we sort of take our eye off the ball a little bit when it comes to why we're actually doing it. So we want to continue to focus on that And we want to make sure that it's, again, those business goals that need to be achieved are always our focus, and they're clear and explicit when we're building out our process and designing our solution. Another thing that tends to trip us up is the exceptions. So common trap to fall into is focusing too much on, what people will call the happy path, or what is the common process or the common sequence of events that, we're trying to automate or, we're trying to build for. But we don't think about ways sometimes to handle those exceptional processes or to provide proper error handling when we're building a flow. When a user might do something that's unexpected, or an integration with an external system potentially, doesn't behave the way that we think it's going to, how are we handling those things? So we want to understand those, we want to understand those exceptions and make sure that we're accounting for them as part of our good design. A common argument that, you may run into, and I've definitely sort of said this myself, is, people focusing on, let's focus on the 80%, let's not try and automate, these fringe cases. And you don't always have to automate the fringe cases. And I generally support that, but, it's more about the perspective of what should we be automating versus perhaps something that can be a manual process, and more about ensuring that we don't design ourselves into a corner when we're aware of these exceptions, and making sure that we're factoring, at least we're factoring them into our overall design. The last point on this particular section is to not be a victim of your own success. So when you're out there dazzling people in your company with all these cool and hopefully useful automation solutions that you've built out, you're hoping people notice. And of course, once they do, you may end up in a situation where they start coming to you for more enhancements and more automation. And before you know it, you've got a really large backlog of requests to work through. I've seen this happen firsthand, and if it's happening to you, it's more important than ever to really stay disciplined and kind of resist that urge to just rush in and knock things off the list and not really pay attention to those best practices, not adhere to that philosophy that you have. You want to ensure that you're thinking things through, that you are looking at what you already have built, and maybe there are things that can be tweaked as opposed to completely rebuilding from scratch and creating some duplication just because it's faster. So definitely want to be thinking through those particular items. I'm going to do a quick pause here and just check in, Jen, if there are any questions or comments or things that we want to revisit.
All right, let me take a look. There's a comment, awesome insight about creating one flow for all changes in an object. And let me go to the Trailblazer community and see if there's anything posted there. And if anybody has questions, please take the time to post if you do have something. And I do not see anything out on the Trailblazer community.
Great.
But there is one question that just came in. How do you avoid being a victim of your own success? Explain briefly, please.
I guess what I would add to that is you want to, I guess, keep doing an amazing job, right? So if you think through, things that you did to deliver high value business processes or, successful implementations are going to lead to more requests. And chances are the first time you did it, you went through the proper process. You really thought things through and you sort of approached it from different perspectives and, built out something that, really works well. So when I talk about avoiding, becoming a victim of your own success. As the work starts to pile up, you want to be able to deal with it in that consistent fashion and sort of maintain that level of excellence and not get complacent. So if you rush in and start, focusing on clearing out that backlog as your main objective because people are breathing down your neck, you may end up in a situation where you're starting to cut corners or skip steps and not really thinking things through because you're just so focused on knocking off the backlog. Better off in that situation to, if you have the means, to expand your team or again, get some additional help, train some people internally potentially, and if that doesn't work, then always focus on prioritizing. So as that list builds out, making sure that you've got a good mechanism for prioritizing those requests, and then dealing with the highest priority ones first.
All right, and Pankaj says, I'm a new admin, but I have seen people very averse of using Flow. Many seasoned developers say debugging Flow is very hard and unpredictable and still favor using Apex most of the time, as it also helps in the sequence of execution.
Sure. I mean, I think that's the kind of answer I would expect from a seasoned developer. It's a perspective for sure. Later, I will talk about more than one way to do things, and that's kind of one of the things with Salesforce. A lot of it, I think, can come down to preference or matter of opinion. But as a, speaking from a perspective where she's approaching it as a new admin, I would recommend diving into Flow sooner rather than later. It's something that, I put off as well because it seemed so complicated, but it is really, really powerful and probably closer to a dev tool than really anything else that you're going to get declaratively, I guess, in Salesforce. So I would definitely encourage them to try it and make that call on their own.
I'd also note that debugging flows used to be difficult, but with the recent releases and the Flow debugger, it's much more easier now than it was before and much easier than debugging Process Builder. So I would suggest having them take another look at Flow.
Definitely. I didn't know that you could debug Process Builder, but we'll leave that for another time. All right.
Great. That's all the questions we have so far.
Awesome. Thanks very much for the questions. Appreciate them. All right, so we'll move into the next section of our discussion, which I've titled Build for the Future. And while I've titled it Build for the Future, I want to be absolutely clear with everyone on the call that this does not mean trying to think of every conceivable feature and trying to incorporate them into your solution. We want to be efficient in our approach. We want to be efficient in our design, and we want to ultimately build things that are actually needed, that are going to deliver business value. So building for the future, in this context and how I'm going to talk about it, is really about building things that will stand the test of time. Now, again, let's put it in perspective. When it comes to technology, when it comes to Salesforce, standing the test of time isn't going to mean something that you won't have to fix for 20 years, but you sort of get my drift. We want to be thinking about things that are going to be robust and building in such a way that, we're not going to have to completely redo it as, as we get busier and as things change. So we'll talk a little bit about testing. And again, my view on testing, I think, has matured as my career has advanced, but definitely something that I've developed more of an affinity for over the years. One thing that I did learn early on in sort of the Salesforce space is the sandbox is your friend, and you want to treat that sandbox as a friend and really kind of work at that relationship. We all want to sort of I think, get things moving, get things implemented and tried out. And when it comes to automation, we want to get our solutions out there. We want people to use them and start taking advantage of them, because they're things that we take pride in. They're one of the things that you can sort of showcase, right? We want to be sure that we do test things, and sure, like we kind of air quotes test things, but if we're being disciplined with our implementation, we can't just rely on simple unit tests. And I've done this, I'm sure we all have. But especially when we have processes that are updating data, so maybe changing records, or worse, deleting records. Think about it from a couple perspectives. I think when it comes to testing, most of us are system admins, and we're in here building these things. And depending on what we're building, are we really testing it end to end as specific user types, or are we kind of logged in as our admin, or we're running things in system mode where permissions aren't really a consideration? Are we thinking that through and testing it properly? Are we testing in a sandbox that actually has other automations, or maybe managed packages, or other pieces of code or customization that have been done in production, that depending on how you set up your sandbox, maybe it's not really a true representation of that prod environment? So I think those are things that can sort of, you can trip up on if you're not careful. So you want to be, when we say testing, we want to test it properly. So we want to test it and make sure that we've got the system behaving in the sandbox the way that it is going to behave in production ultimately. Another point on testing is really on the data side. So are we testing in an environment that has enough records to actually test things accurately? One project that I was working on recently, I thought I'd built a pretty cool process to lock and unlock related records while I guess there was an unrelated approval process, but because of their business process, we needed some underlying records to not be touched while this approval process was happening. It looked really good on paper. I was able to build it and run it and did a quick test, and it was successful. But of course, when I ran it in a partial sandbox where there was some actual data in there, the first thing I ran into was SOQL limit, because the way I had originally designed it, it was querying, I think, all the records instead of just a subset. So again, little things like that, which are, if you're not testing properly, it will be pretty embarrassing if you rolled something like that out in production or to an end client, and the first time they try it, it doesn't actually work. So definitely want to be sure that you're testing everything out end to end, different users, make sure there's data in there, so that we can really get a true representation of how that automation is going to perform, and how it's going to perform with sufficient load. Now we also have to document things. I spent a good chunk of my career as a business analyst and business systems analyst, and then leading teams of BAs. And I'm not necessarily a believer in having, or a proponent of having, tons of lengthy documentation. But I think the goal really has to be that we want to create good documentation, and it's ultimately we want to create systems that deliver good value to our users and have it supported with, I guess, the appropriate level of documentation. So it doesn't mean that we don't need documentation or that we need to skimp on it, but it's, again, just quality over quantity. I've seen requirements documents that are 200 pages that could probably be 20 pages just because they're too verbose, but we really need to be focused on that. Where I've seen things get lost over time is, again, when I talked earlier about understanding the why of the process, or the rationale, what that sort of business rationale was or is for a particular set of requirements. One of the great things about the Salesforce platform is that it's really easy to, well, I shouldn't say really easy, it can be depending on how people set things up. Let's say it's fairly easy to piece together and figure out how a solution actually works when we dig into the logic and dig into setup. So we can look at formulas and figure out what they're trying to do. We can definitely look at flows and understand how it fits together and what the various pieces are and what it's trying to accomplish, and roll-ups and things like that. We can look at permissions, although, you know, that's probably a whole nother topic for sure. But even if we didn't build it, we can have a look through setup at all those various pieces and kind of figure out what's happening. It's not ideal, but it could be done. What we can't really see, particularly if you're new to the org, is the why behind all of that. So why did we even build this process in the first place? What is it really meant to do? So you definitely want to have this information tied to your overall solution design and for the, you know, sort of the bits and bytes that fit together. And even if you're a solo admin, so if you're in a company and you're working by yourself and you probably have a great memory, you know, there may be a day where you move on or you expand your team, which is something that happened to me. You know, and you haven't if you haven't experienced this, you know, it's not always that easy as you think to remember every single piece of every single solution that you've ever put together, or every meeting that you've been in where somebody, you know, gave you some information and it's in your head and you sort of worked it into the solution. So you definitely want to take the time to write these things down. And just a couple more points on documentation. I would say what I try and do, and I try and recommend others to do, is document as much as possible directly in Salesforce. So those description fields that are there are not meant to be blank, and definitely don't populate them with something too generic like, you know, automated update or, you know, this process updates account records or something like that. You know, you want to be descriptive. If someone comes along after you, or again, expand your team, move on, you know, you want to be able to have as much information in the system as possible. You can also do things like, you know, I'm surprised more people don't do this. Definitely developers do. They sort of have that mindset as adding comments inline directly into Salesforce. So if you've got formula fields, for example, you can add comments in there. Certainly if you have Apex code, you can add comments in there. And this just really helps with the overall management and the overall understanding of the system when you're, again, as things evolve and build, you start building on top of things, you really want to, you know, maintain that, that level of documentation. So the first place we're probably going to look is in the Salesforce setup. Definitely ideal to have that information in there. And then secondly, when it comes to documentation, it needs to be accessible. So if your documentation is, you know, not available, can't easily be retrieved, it's not really going to help anybody, right? Depending on the size of your team and the complexity of your org, it could be simple. It could be as simple as a shared doc or a spreadsheet, or you could have, you know, formal third-party tools, right? So if you've got some source code management systems or, you know, bug tracking apps that you use, a lot of these oftentimes have pretty good documentation features, so those are options available to you as well. Another option that sometimes people don't really think of is Salesforce in terms of documenting. So you've got files and libraries and, you know, sort of things that you can do in Salesforce. You could build a, you know, potentially build a custom object of, you know, user stories or requirements, or, you know, however you want to manage these sorts of things to show, you know, how your solution works. And then again, through files and libraries, tie in the actual artifacts or the, you know, the documents. And, you know, really, besides being accessible, it needs to be up to date. So you can write a really high quality document, explains exactly how everything works, but next week when you go and update the process, or, you know, you update some formulas behind the scenes, if you're not updating the overall solution documentation, it's not really that useful. So I think when it comes to that solution documentation, it's really about pointing people to where things are, as opposed to, you know, line by line repeating what the formula was, repeating, you know, all of the Apex classes or the actual, you know, specifics around the flow. So keep that in mind as well. And again, just quality over quantity. It's not about writing the longest or the most verbose document in the world. It's about having something that people can actually pick up and use and get in there and troubleshoot. Last thing, if you're interested or if it's something that has come up in your org before, depending on, again, level of sophistication and what you want to accomplish, you can also check out the App Exchange. There's some pretty great tools out there in terms of documenting your org. One in particular, Elements Cloud, very rich, not only from a documentation perspective, but doing full dependency and impact analysis on kind of how things fit together. So if you're sort of at that caliber and really looking to take it to the next level, definitely something that you can check out. The next point around what if we triple our business is really just about scale. Now, you may not be a technical architect, but you want to be thinking about scale when it comes to your overall solution design. So are we picking the right tool? And we talked earlier about picking the right tool for the job. Are we picking the right tool based on just what we know today? Are we thinking about growth or potential growth? Do we understand that sort of side of the equation? Do we even know how much data and processing is going to be required for the sort of present day solution, or are we just jumping in and using the tool that we're most comfortable with? So definitely want to be thinking about scale and those kinds of things. We, as I mentioned earlier, tend to spend a lot of time and maybe too much time on those functional requirements and just really what the system needs to do, but we're not thinking about scalability. Scalability even is either an afterthought or worst case scenario, not even a consideration. And if you have a sense of that scalability or kind of what those future throughput requirements need to be, it's definitely something that you need to be or want to be aware of going in. So don't just think about scale solely from a system perspective. You want to think about it from a team or a personnel perspective as well. So depending on what you're designing, again, which tool are we going to use? Do we actually have the right people in here to be able to support this and manage it long term? Do we need to bring in new talent? Are we looking to develop people internally? Definitely have a plan for how we're going to continue to grow and scale the team to support the evolving org. Last point on this one is to conduct regular reviews and really stay organized. So you could be following all the best practices. You could have great naming standards. You can have one process or one automation tool per object. You could be doing all the right things and building out the most elegant, the most efficient solutions possible. But it's still always good to conduct regular reviews of the org to keep yourself on track. So some things to look for as you're doing these sort of org reviews. Do we still need X? Do we need this automation that we built 4 years ago? Is it better to do Y? Is it better, maybe some things have changed since it was originally built. Is there a better way to do it? It's also helpful, I think, when you're doing these things to have someone who might not be as familiar with the setup of your particular org to come in and give a fresh perspective. There are definitely different ways to do things, and we saw that with one of the earlier questions. But a set of outside eyes can really help, and I think it's equally important to, for both parties, I guess, for the person coming in to look at the org and for the person showing the org to check their egos. There are, again, different ways to do things in Salesforce, and sometimes it's a matter of opinion, but I think when you kind of check your ego at the door, if you will, you can really keep a more open mind and make sure that you've got a sound solution in there, and that we're building it out for the future. Quick story is now that I'm on the consulting side, one of the things that we do typically when we engage with a new client, if it's a Salesforce optimization, so they may already have Salesforce in-house, is we do one of these org reviews, and it's always kind of an interesting and a fun experience. I think it's kind of like, I would describe it as giving someone a tour of your house, but they're getting the full tour of the house, right? So they're seeing maybe the bedroom closet, they're seeing the basement or the tool shed, like places where you would just kind of shove things. If you're having a dinner party, you're not really typically going to bring people in. You're trying to declutter the house as quickly as you can, so you just throw everything into the closet. some orgs will actually look like that, and I think we're all guilty. We've all sort of done these things, and it's always interesting to me to kind of go through, because a lot of times you're dealing with people that are pretty strong and pretty pretty experienced admins, and there's always that kind of like sheepish embarrassment. It's like, oh yeah, this this was here before. This was a year before I joined the company, or these kinds of things. There's always some explanation, and hey, like don't be. We've all, I think we've all could probably cite examples of these things in our own org where we just did something because it seemed like a good idea at the time, or we were under pressure and we wanted to get things done, so we just maybe just went ahead and built something, and then we sort of end up living with these things over time. So I think whether it's formal, informal, internal, external, definitely good to conduct regular reviews of the org and sort of be reflective of what's in there and make sure that you're continuing to improve it. And our last section, actually, maybe I'll pause there just real quick for any comments or questions before we get into the last one.
All right, we do have one question. Which tool do you prefer for documentation?
Which tool do I prefer for documentation? I have not had the opportunity to use one of the like AppExchange org documenter tools. I've seen them. I would like to try one, but I haven't had personal experience with it, although they do look pretty rich. So I would like to use something like that. I don't have any practical experience doing it in any of my particular orgs, but what I have done in the past, which I have preferred, is actually having that documentation in Salesforce, because again, you've got your files, you can tie in your requirements or your user stories as custom objects if you wanted to, and then you've got that chatter and file versioning capability built in. So I do kind of like that, and it also plays well because you're on the platform, right? So you're in there, and that's where you're going to have a lot of that documentation.
And that's all we have for questions.
Wonderful, thank you. So our last section is, learn from others and helping others, and I guess you could also label this just being a good community member. So, as I mentioned early on, when I first started, I really kind of relied on the Trailblazer community a lot, and was able to learn a ton. So, in my first role in Salesforce, quite frankly, adoption wasn't good at the start. Like a lot of us have probably experienced that. So that's also probably a topic for another day. But eventually, we got things rolling. But in the interim, I had time. I was able to sort of tap into the Trailblazer community and really get a sense and a feel for how much incredible knowledge and talent was out there, and people just again readily sharing best practices and ideas. So for me, it's still a go-to in terms of staying on top of and learning new things about Salesforce. When it comes to automation specifically, obviously, we have this group and we have the Salesforce Automation Trailblazer community, which are really, really great resources. One thing, that I guess I would caution on, or is sort of a lesson learned when it comes to all this great information out in the community, is that there's almost too much of it. There are so many groups and so many sort of different sources of information that it really can become overwhelming, and you could fall into a case where you have information overload. So much like reviewing your solutions, I would encourage you to review and really be selective about the groups that you're spending your time with. So how active are the groups? What kind of information is being shared? Is it really good quality? Is it just kind of reposting things that are already available elsewhere? Are answers being provided? I think that's a sign of a sort of a good Trailblazer community, and something that you want to be a part of. Is when people ask questions, is the community actually coming in with answers and suggestions, right? So definitely think about those things as a source of information and something that you can also contribute to. Blogs are amazing source of information. There's obviously lots of great Salesforce blogs out there, particularly some people that are co-hosts on this particular automation hour. So definitely look no further than your Automation Hour co-hosts for some great content. But there's lots of good blogs out there. And again, similar sort of criteria when you're evaluating, is this something that you want to spend time following? How recent is the information? Are there regular posts or things that are relevant to you, depending on what stage you are, what stage you're at in your particular situation in your career with Salesforce. Salesforce Ben actually recently had a post about top developer and admin blogs. I don't know if you saw that, but if you're looking for kind of new blogs, or you're just wondering, depending on places to get more information, I think that is a great post and something that you could definitely check out. Community events also, again, great kind of great source of information, great opportunity to network, meet other people, and learn how they're using Salesforce, maybe learn something new. I think the community events are outstanding for that, and again, really shows the passion and kind of the commitment for people to volunteer their time to actually go and present or contribute to these community events. I think is one of the things that makes Salesforce unique. A couple of years ago, sort of made that commitment to myself to become more involved in the local admin user group here in Toronto, and it's really paid dividends. I'm really thankful for that, and definitely encourage people to participate in their local community groups. And kind of, I guess, one of the positive things about the whole COVID situation is that a lot of these groups are now doing virtual meetings, which, if you're not sort of in the local geography, really gives you opportunity to participate in things that you otherwise wouldn't have had a chance to participate in. So, check out notices for different community groups that are taking place virtually, and make some new contacts and learn some new things along the way. So there's some definite opportunities there for you. And last and certainly not least, Trailhead and Salesforce. So, Trailhead's obviously, pretty cool. And one of the unique things about Salesforce, giving away sort of all that training and giving it away for free, but all those skills that you can learn and different things that you can try if you're willing to invest the time. It's pretty amazing. But last but certainly not least is, the actual stay on top of Salesforce innovation and the regular releases. I know that many of us will start rethinking maybe some of the process builders that we built versus Flow as a tool with some of the innovation that's is coming in summer 20. But it just underscores the fact that you can never really get complacent when it comes to Salesforce. You have to stay on top of things. You can't possibly know everything, and that's okay, but sort of know where to get that information. And I think when you think about the people that are out there leading the charge that really know a lot, it's because they actually make that focused effort, and they devote that time to continuing to learn, right? They don't just know it and then it's in their heads forever. They have to stay sharp. They have to stay on top of things. They have to stay, continue to contribute to the community and really get a handle on everything. So I think that's something that we can all do a better job of, and really it really does pay off ultimately. So that was it in terms of what I wanted to talk to. I apologize. I think I talked a little bit longer than I had originally anticipated, but we do have a few more minutes. If there are additional questions or comments or anything that people want to bring up.
Great. So if folks have additional comments, you can either post them on the questions within this GoToWebinar, or you can post them out on the Trailblazer Community Salesforce Automation Hour. And there's a comment from Minali, who says, excited to meet you in the next Toronto user group meetup.
Awesome.
Great webinar today.
One thing, maybe one last, I guess, free tip that, again, this is sort of learned by practical experience, and there's obviously tons of help documentation on the Salesforce site directly, but if you're gonna, when it comes to automation, if you're gonna read anything, when it comes to Salesforce help documentation, read all the articles that are on there about limits, and it's invaluable. You definitely want to understand that, because you don't want to be learning it through trial and error.
Great. I do not see any new questions come in. Let me just do another refresh.
For sure.
Right, I think that is it. Great pearls of wisdom. Definitely a lot to take in and actually implement and
No,
follow.
appreciate you having me on. And yeah, I mean, definitely encourage everyone to make sure they register for the remaining automation hours throughout the rest of the year. It's you know, invaluable. So
Great, and come back and show us something else or share some more nuggets with us.
we'll try my best. Thank you very much.
All right, so with that, we're going to close out this automation hour. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good one. Bye.